Yeah, that could happen. It'll be nice to hear that performer when they get it up to tempo. That'll be great.
That's Dennis Brain, right?
Yeah, whatever. When he finally gets it to tempo, it'll be really cool. So anyway, thanks for having me to do this, and good afternoon to everyone. Uh, Most horn players have heard. Oh, by the way, this is, of course, the boring history lecture, so strap it on. Okay, so most horn players have heard, and many have even read, that the natural horn remained dominant in Paris during the 19th century. The first books that address this subject, you just got a little preview of, were by Reginald Morley-Pegge and by Burchard Core. Burchard Core's self-published book that appeared in the 1950s on the 19th century players and teachers in Paris sort of poured the foundation for this understanding of the natural horn's dominance. And then Morley-Pegge's General History of the Horn that appeared first in 1960 in its first edition reinforced the legend that the Paris Conservatoire was a relatively conservative bunch. They held tightly to the past, resistant to valve technology, at least applied to the horn, and then only relented somewhat grudgingly at the turn of the 20th century. Many folks have researched this topic since, but most people who write term papers, even dissertations and articles, tend to return to these two books as the summary opinion on this time and place for the horn. So this presentation then begins with a relatively famous quote that appears in the Morley-Pegge book. In 1922, Francois Brémond, who was the horn instructor at the Paris Conservatory, sent a letter to his former student, Reginald Morley-Pegge, responding to a question about when and how the valve horn class was reinstituted at the Conservatoire. And you can see this quote here: "My dear Pegge, the valve horn class had not been held since 1863, and it was I who asked Monsieur Ambroise Thomas to allow me to hold one valve horn class every week. I then got permission for the sight reading test at the annual public examination, that's the Concours, to be played on the valve horn. For this, the student fitted a detachable set of valves to his instrument in public. And finally, both the set piece and the sight reading test to be played on the valve horn, hand technique to be retained for specifically hand horn phrases. From then on, 1897, his date, the valve horn class was held virtually, if not officially, reinstated by me. Hand horn until 1896, hand and valve horn from 1897 to 1902, and valve horn since 1903. Now, as one does more research into brass instruments in general at that time in Paris, this foundation of understanding of the valve horn has always seemed a bit overstated because there was a lot of innovative activity going on in Paris during the entire 19th century, including whole movements in support of valve brass instruments applied to band, some orchestras, solo, and chamber music. And then as we dig deeper and we learn more about the types of music and composers represented in Paris during this time, including performances of, on the conservative side, Saint-Saëns and Franck, let alone Wagner operas on the progressive side, we can't help but wonder, was the Conservatoire really that steadfast with regard to the natural horn? And if so, why? My talk today will present information according to three periods of time that lead to the final transition to the valve horn at the Conservatoire. The beginning, the arrival of valve instruments in Paris in the 1820s and their initial reception. The middle period, from the 1850s to the 1890s, where we find all kinds of interesting activity and opinions about what would be best for the horn and its music. And then, of course, the end, the final transition to the valve horn in the 1890s and then into the early 1900s. And I must say right up front that part of this presentation is, in fact, a shameless plug. Some of you watching this presentation may be familiar with other presentations and articles that I have offered on this subject, sort of on this subject. And this presentation today ups the ante on everything that I've done before. Admittedly, this is done in part to promote a new book that will be published by Routledge this summer. I just saw the final proof. It's really cool. But it should be noted that the information presented here covers only maybe a third of this book and really only summarizes it. It doesn't really cover it. So you still got to buy it. But the book itself covers all horn teaching done at the Conservatoire, both natural horn and valved horn, over the period from the time the Conservatoire was formed in the early 1790s until this point in time, 1903, and will, I hope, clarify a number of issues that have been relatively unresolved or unaddressed so far. And I hope this will lead to other inspirations for more research, whether to build on what's presented here or to prove me wrong. I dare you. Go ahead. It's okay. All right, so on to the beginning. When did valves first arrive in Paris, and how was the valve applied to the horn? Valve trumpets and horns were first sent to Paris around 1826 by the composer Gaspar Spontini, who at the time was working as the Kapellmeister at the Berlin State Opera. Spontini had lived and worked in Paris previously and was so inspired by German valve brass playing that he had heard that he sent some German instruments to specific individuals in Paris. The horns he sent were received by Louis-François Dauprat, the famous horn professor at the Conservatoire at the time, who had already made a name for himself in Paris as a performer and teacher of the natural horn. In everything he wrote, from his method to a bunch of other things that he wrote later on, Dauprat is clear that the changes in timbre associated with the natural horn made it a much more expressive instrument, and as a result, a more desirable instrument than any other in the orchestra, at brass or otherwise. Upon receiving a valved horn, Dauprat examined it closely, and he produced a brief method for the instruments, 5 pages long, which is amazing because his method for natural horn is like almost 500 pages. Dauprat examined the instrument closely and produced this brief method in 1828 that addressed what he felt was the best way to use the instrument. This method is now available on IMSLP and shows a very clear application of the valves as a means of enhancing the resources of the natural horn. How did he describe this? Hand technique is described as desirable, and combinations of hand and valve happening simultaneously are recommended, such that the good aspects of the natural horn are preserved, and that specifically about the different colors that are available for expressive performance, and its less desirable characteristics are minimized. And that is, of course, using valves to play more stable notes, both open and stopped, especially in the middle and low registers. And he produced a chart that you can see here on the right-hand side, showing combined hand positions and valve fingerings, so the player could exercise options in playing dependent on melodic and harmonic context, as well as, you guessed it, good taste. A second important figure also entered the picture at this time, Joseph-Émile Meifred. Maifred built on Dauprat's ideas and became a well-respected performer on the valved instrument, leading to his appointment as the first valved horn instructor at the Conservatoire in 1833. Maifred's method was that you see here on the right-hand side was completed in 1840 and took this combined approach to a very high level. And again, if you've seen some of my articles or presentations before, I'm going to reiterate the 5 goals of Maifred's method as a way of establishing the sort of foundation here. First of all, the valved horn and the method involved here gives the horn notes that it lacks. In other words, it fills in gaps in the harmonic series, especially in the low range. It gives accuracy of intonation to some notes. In other words, to improve intonation by having more technical choices and thus more control over all notes. Number 3, to render stop notes sonorous while preserving lightly stopped notes for which the timbre is desirable. This celebrates the fact that while valves offer more open notes, some use of stop color is still desirable in combination with those open notes. Number 4, to give the leading tone in every key or mode the countenance it has in the natural range. And by this, Meifred means that a note in a melodic leading tone position should have a certain countenance or presence. And that usually means to change the timbre to be something more closed, such that in the melodic motion to the tonic sound is more open and thus emphasized. So as a result, timbre and pitch of the leading tone can be better controlled involving the hand, and of course leading to an open tonic in any context. And then finally, not to deprive composers of crook changes, each of which has a special color. So in this case, Maifred initially promoted a two-valved instrument that allowed for terminal crooks up at the mouthpipe. Well, but later he decided that a horn crooked in F with a terminal lead pipe was actually better. Or I'm sorry, a two-valved instrument that allowed for orchestral crooks. So you put them in the end, but the terminal lead pipe was better. The fixed lead pipe was better. While this might suggest that valves were used as crooking devices, if we think that out a bit further, Maifred really only mentions that as a possibility, as an option, not as a priority in terms of playing technique. Obviously, the availability of valves meant that the horn could accomplish harmonic modulations more easily and more quickly without having to stop and take out a crook and put a new one in, but also that both open and stop notes made available by the valves could be considered in the process of deciding what combinations of technique and technology to use, all in the name of good taste. And by the way, the crook changes and so forth, all of this stuff, what's hidden behind this is that Maifred is actually the person who invented the concept of adding valve slides or slides to the valve tubes to improve intonation when one adds a new crook. Anyway, I thought that's a very interesting sort of combination of elements involving hand technique and the valve technology. And that's associated with this method book from 1840. It should be noted that Maifred, like I said before, preferred two valves to three, but by 1850, he had accepted the three-valved instrument as the norm, especially if it had the newly invented ascending valve technology applied to the third valve, the ascending third valve. Still, even with that instance, the active combining of hand stopping in the valve was the rule for Maifred and his students. The implications for performing music of this type will be summarized at the end here. I'll get to that. Maifred's approach of combining the two was roundly supported in the Conservatoire community, especially among those who supported the expressive character of the natural horn, those who wanted performers to show respect for composer intentions in older works, and those who appreciated the desire to exploit the best of all worlds, right? Who wouldn't? In the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, even in the band community where valved instruments were not only welcomed, but celebrated to the exclusion of many others, mostly by drowning them all out. Maifred, who was also a strong advocate for military music and band music, was credited as the leader of valve horn performance and teaching at the time. What must be acknowledged, however, is that the combined technique, the hand and the valve together, was not used by everyone, especially in large groups where the expressive effects were lost in the mass of sound. It's also interesting to note during this time that when Dauprat retired in 1842, his successor, Jacques-François Gallay, was hired to teach only the natural horn. And nowhere in any of Gallay's writings have I ever found anything mentioning the valve horn's existence, let alone its use. So that's kind of an interesting sidelight here. So this combined approach serves to summarize the first period, the beginning period, of the valve horn in Paris and at the Conservatoire. It should be noted that there were other valve horn methods that appeared in the 1840s, and of those, there seemed to be two types. Those that were derived directly from Maifred, and others that try to take his approach in a different direction. For example, using the valve horn as an instrument of all open notes. It's also reasonable to think that the development of instruments that were adapted, in other words, like valve trumpets, valve trombones, and tubas a little later on, and as well as, in some cases, instruments that were specifically designed for military band, like sax horns, also may have distracted from or even discouraged the use of the valves attached to the horns. In other words, they were pointing the wrong direction to begin with, so let's focus on these other ones in these types of settings, like the military or band music. It's military music, however, that contributes to a larger discussion of the next period, the middle period of the valved horn in Paris. This middle period lasts 1850 to 1890, and the focus of attention, at least at first in this presentation, is an institution called the Gymnase de Musique Militaire. This was a school specifically for French military musicians, and its first iteration was actually created before the Conservatoire was founded in the early 1890s. As with many institutions, it went through a variety of ups and downs, especially during the 1830s when it went through a significant reorganization. In the 1850s, however, the school went through yet another difficult period, and the result this time was the absorption of all of its military music classes into the Conservatoire. At that time, the only official valved instrument taught at the Conservatoire was the horn, taught by Maifred. But the new military music classes were taught by some of the existing Conservatoire faculty, and some new teachers were added. Among them, Joseph Forestier, who taught the cornet à piston, the valved cornet, Adolphe Sax, who taught the saxophone, and Jean-Baptiste Arban, who was hired to teach sax horn. Forestier, by the way, studied natural horn with Dauprat at the Conservatoire and was a two-time Concours Prize winner. He got second prize in 1834 and first prize in 1835. At some point, he moved to the trumpet and then to the valved cornet, and played with the opera orchestra from 1844 to 1868. He stayed on the Conservatoire staff as part of the military music classes from 1856, when they were formed, until they were suppressed again in 1870. In 1857, Antoine Dieppe, who had been hired as the first trombone teacher in 1836, added valve trombone to his teaching duties. Accounts of the trumpet class, which had been taught by Francois d'Auvernay from its beginning in 1833, are a little vague and resemble the horn trajectory, with the natural trumpet taught officially until 1892, when it appears that natural horn or natural trumpets and valve trumpets were taught in the same class. There are accounts, however, of d'Auvernay particularly playing valve trumpets in the opera as early as the 1820s. So valve trumpets were definitely treated differently, and thankfully are not relevant anymore to this presentation right now. As far as valve instruments in general, however, there were plenty of confusing ideas and concerns about valve brass during this time. And in 1861, Arban, who was still the sax horn teacher at the time, petitioned the Conservatoire director, Daniel Aubert, to begin a valved horn class separate from the military music classes. And the response from Aubert was actually somewhat revealing, and it fits with what we just heard about Joseph Forestier, the horn player who became a cornet player. His response was, "It's true that the valve cornet becomes a very useful instrument in the orchestra nowadays, and that many composers dedicate an important part to it. However, so far there seems to have been no need to create a special class for the valve cornet at the Conservatoire, since most pupils that follow and graduate from the horn, trombone, and trumpet classes are able to play the cornet in our theater orchestras and public concerts. Some of them have become quite famous. Therefore, I do not believe that the creation of a class for valve cornets is justified at the moment." Now, you can see here that Aubert's response, and we can assume that the Conservatoire administration sort of felt the same way, that the military training going on at that time, 1861, was probably sufficient, and perhaps teaching of the existing sort of transitional instruments or traditional instruments, sorry, gave the students the foundations they needed to pick up other instruments like the cornet later on if they chose. It's also worth remembering at this point that the cornet à piston, the valve cornet, had been thought of by many, including Hector Berlioz, as a soprano member of the horn family, not necessarily as a relative of the trumpet. So still, it's clear from the actual accounts of the valve cornet class at the Conservatoire that it was treated completely separately, as first as part of the military music offerings, and then later on in 1869, Arban finally did make his case, and convincingly, and he was hired to take over the cornet à piston class, and that continued after the military music classes were discontinued in 1870. So my point here is there's a lot of valved activity going on in the Conservatoire at this time. And again, it's kind of confusing and a little bit, sort of, there's politics involved, Saxe and Arban and so forth. But we're still talking about the valve horn, remember? Okay. So with this in mind, it's confusing that a decision was made to discontinue the valve horn class in 1864, at least in hindsight. Until 1864, natural horn and valve horn were well represented by Gallay and Maifred. But in 1864, first Maifred officially retired on October 1st, and then Gallay died on October 18th. And then for some unknown reason, on November 1st, the Conservatoire administration officially discontinued the valve horn class, deciding to keep the natural horn class. Clearly at a crossroads, the administration had choices, right, with both of them gone. One of which could have been to hire replacements for both teachers, for both classes. They didn't. They could have looked to the future and chosen to hire a valve horn teacher and let the traditions of the natural horn fade away. They didn't. They could have hired a valve horn specialist to play, who could play some natural horn, or vice versa, which would make the most sense in terms of horn activity at the time. They didn't do that either. What they did do is they hired Jean-Baptiste Victor Mohr, who was not only a natural horn specialist, but also a former student of Gallay and apparently committed to maintaining the traditional instrument. In view of Albert's comments to Arban above, however, or what I just talked about, it's possible that the valve horn could have been viewed as close enough to be included in other studios or picked up after graduating. But still, one would think that there was enough evidence from past instruction, especially with Maifred's success, to make the valve horn a priority at this institution. So, nevertheless, no matter what, they hired Jean-Baptiste Victor Mohr. He was an outstanding player. He won the first prize in natural horn in 1847, again as a student of Gallay. In 1853, he joined the opera orchestra, and he served there for 30 years. There are numerous accounts in a variety of journals of performances of solos and chamber music in which he was involved, and it's clear that they were well received. Especially noticed was his ability to blend open and stop timbres. And here's an example of that from 1868. All applauded as was deserved. A horn solo, La Séparation, by Lawrence, played by Mr. Mohr. It would certainly have been encored if the theme of the romance had not been repeated several times in the piece. Okay, it's absolute perfection. There are moments when one is tempted to believe that the performer has removed the stop sounds, so great is the homogeneity of his playing. There's actually a somewhat inconclusive report of Mohr teaching a valve horn. In a report on musical instruments displayed at the 1867 Paris World Exposition, the critic François-Joseph Petite, after describing brass instruments on display at this exposition and railing a bit at the continued prejudice against the valve horn in France, stated that on each of these valves, on a valve horn, all the open notes of the horn are found because the tubes are independent. And what he means by that is they are tunable. And consequently, the notes are in tune. By always having whatever note is needed at one's disposal, the artist can produce it immediately. Mr. Mohr, here's the key here. Mr. Mohr, virtuoso on the horn and professor at the Paris Conservatoire, today teaches his students the use of this new instrument, which promises France good hornists for their orchestras. So here's the problem. If Mohr did actually teach some valved horn at the time, there's no evidence of it anywhere in conservatoire records, at least that I've been able to find. And I'm not the only one looking. Burke Anderson, who is a Pacific Northwest person, hasn't found it either. I'll talk a little bit more about him in a minute. So it's possible that Féti's statement has an element of wishful thinking, this account does. And when Mohr created his own method a year later for his teaching at the Conservatoire, it's devoted exclusively to the natural horn. You can see he identifies first and second horn, and here are his handering charts. For first horn with all of the different hand positions, and for second horn. Notice that even with all of that, the instrument is conceived as a chromatic instrument through its full range, with hand positions accordingly. Interesting. The significance of Mohr then at the Conservatoire then is that his influence maintained a priority for the natural horn as a primary type of instrument taught until his passing in 1891, despite a great deal of controversy and considerable real-world activity outside of the Conservatoire in Paris that supported the modern valve instrument during his tenure. Toward the end of his tenure, in Le Ménestrel, a journal, in November of 1886, an article appeared written by Camille Saint-Saëns, the composer, and it shows not only the continuing problem facing composers who wanted to write for the valved horn, but also the continuing practice of using crooked instruments, even then. Saint-Saëns expressed a desire to write for all instruments so that they would be non-transposing. Can you imagine that? If they had made that change back then and we all played in concert pitch, wouldn't that be interesting? And as a result, though, would be able to play all the time in any key. He said the following: nowadays, chromaticism is used much more often than in the past, which means that sudden modulations cannot always be executed by the horn. To do so, they would have to change the crook, which again means that the orchestra has to do for a few bars without the horns, since replacing a crook on the instrument by another one of a different temperature and consequently too low, flat, it takes time. Some will say that there's always hand stopping that allows a chromatic scale equal to any other instrument, but even so, if the modulation or the note to be sustained happens to be one of these, the effect is as if the horns did not play at all. And that is where the valved horn comes in. It can play all these notes, but even with a valved horn, there will always be a moment when one is obliged to change the crook because the system does not comprise the range of all the extra crooks. So you can see how everything is still kind of complicated and convoluted. And during this article, Saint-Saëns goes on to recommend that all instruments should be permanently crooked and notated in C. Can you imagine? It was about this time, however, 1886, that two more horn player teachers entered into the story of the valved horn at the Conservatoire. Though they themselves did not teach at the Conservatoire, these two composed horn methods and also participated in a significant event which provides some important additional insight into the perception of the valved horn in the late 1880s. The two individuals involved were Henri Garigue and Henri Chaussier, two Henris. Okay, Henri Garigue, unfortunately I don't have a picture of him, attended the Conservatoire, studied with Gallay, won the first prize in natural horn in 1862. He was an active soloist and chamber musician and played in several orchestras, winding up in the opera orchestra, presumably with Mohr, in 1876. like Chaussier, who we'll hear about in a moment, he was acquainted with Saint-Saëns, who composed the Opus 36 Romance for him. You can see right up here in the top corner, there's Garrigue's name right there. He also wrote a method, the Petite Méthode pour or de cours à piston, extrait de la grande méthode by Henri Jean Garigue. In his method, this method here on the right-hand side, the approach is first and foremost based on the valved horn. There's no natural horn, stuff. It's just we play the valved horn. This is what we do. He does recommend that the natural horn serve as the foundation of beginning study, especially to learn how to use the hand in the bell. But he states unequivocally that the valved instrument can cover the full range needed and that playing the horn with all open notes is the only way to go. All right, Henri Chaussier was a student of Mohr at the Conservatoire, the next generation, winning the first prize in natural horn in 1880. He was also an active performer in Paris, but also spent some time in Berlin over the course of his career. He was also a very creative and gregarious horn designer. Saint-Saëns, by the way, wrote the Opus 67 Romance and the Opus 94 Morceau de Concert for Chaussier. So same person. His method, the Notice explicative pour les nouveaux instruments en out. Trompette, a corps omnitonique et chromatique, cornets, sax horns, and saxophones, inventé par Henri Chaussier. Yes, he created all these instruments. And of course, this method is more accurately a promotional brochure for his own instruments, but it does contain substantive information on playing technique, and it appeared in Paris just before Garrigue's 1886. In his method, Chaussier does mention the old cor simple, the natural horn, and it has served its time well, but with so much chromaticism in music, the valved instrument is necessary to keep up with all the other instruments in the orchestra with consistent tone color throughout its full chromatic range. He also points out that a valved instrument player can still follow composer's intentions and use hand technique where desired and or appropriate. He also suggests that all instruments should be written at concert pitch. He and Saint-Saëns were of a like mind. That may explain the piece written for him. The aforementioned significant event, which Morley-Pegge, Burke Anderson, and especially Claude Maury have all summarized in their research, was a panel comparison held at the Conservatoire on April 11th, 1891. The purpose was to settle a question of whether the valved horn was an appropriate instrument for study at the Conservatoire. This event was the result of an unfortunate refusal of admission to the Conservatoire of a horn student. Actually, it was the son of Garigue, on the grounds of performing on a valved horn, the wrong instrument. Well, and it probably had something to do with parents getting involved in their kids, what their kids deserved. Garigue himself appealed to the Conservatoire on the grounds that no one used the natural horn anymore, and composers no longer wrote for it. Garigue and Chaussier were both invited to make a case for their respective approaches to the instrument. Garigue apparently attempted to demonstrate that everything was playable on a single F horn, and this proved to be a disadvantage, especially in the high range called for in one of the excerpt choices, which was the triumphal march from Handel's Judas Maccabeus on a single F horn. Chaussier was able to navigate all the ranges more easily due to his horn having two descending valves and two ascending valves, a 4-valve instrument. By the way, Uli Hübner has done a wonderful demonstration of this horn in a video that you can find on YouTube. And Chaussier's demonstration apparently showed proper respect for older works with appropriate stop notes and entertaining the possibility of using the valves as crooks, emphasizing the color variation from both hand technique and crook changes as being still available on his horn. As a result, Chaussier and his horn won the day, And the horn in F played the way Garigue demonstrated, in other words, with all open notes, was deemed incomplete and insufficient for these purposes. Now, if you think about it a little bit, this is odd because both horns would have been capable of the same technical choices. You could hand stop a single F in the same way that you could hand stop anything else, right? But apparently, whatever Chaussier said and the way he framed his argument won the panel's favor. The ultimate question of whether or not the natural horn should remain the focus of instruction was not addressed in the panel report, but it is clear from the report itself that some value for hand technique still remained, albeit generally limited to solo playing, and a mix of hand and valve was acceptable, if not necessary, for playing a full range of repertoire. Ironically, Mohr died unexpectedly 3 days later on April 14th, so a new horn teacher was needed. On April 20th, 9 days after the event, Francois Bremond was recommended as Mohr's successor, chosen over 4 other applicants, who included not only Chaussier and Garigue, but 2 other former students of Mohr who were members of local orchestras, Jean-Lazare Penable and Ferdinand Louis-Philippe Rennes. According to the recommendation letter, Bremond's positions with the Société de Concert series and the Opéra Comique were seen as more prestigious than the experiences of the others, and his teaching experience in Lyon was also mentioned as a result or as a reason that he was chosen as Mohr's successor. A year later, the Conservatoire in 1892, the Conservatoire underwent some organizational changes, and documentation of new regulations show that classes were offered 1892 or available for corps ordinaire et chromatique à 3 pistons, natural horn and chromatic horn with 3 valves, as well as what appear to be other mixed classes for flute and piccolo, oboe, English horn, clarinet, bass clarinet, bassoon, contrabassoon, valve trumpet and cornet, alto tenor and bass trombone, all in the same class, and sax horns from 3 to 6 valves. Yay. This is important because it means the door was open for Bremond to offer valve horn instruction essentially at the time he was hired. Still, the transition to the valve instrument still took, or apparently took, a few more years to occur. So now we enter the final stage, and I go into hyperdrive of the transition of the valve horn to the at the Conservatoire. Bremond was officially appointed on May 1st, about a week after all that happened, or another week after that, and taught there until his retirement in January of 1923. He reportedly played on an 1823 Raoult natural horn with a sauterelle, a detachable set of valves, with extra valve tubes for lower crooks. He also preferred the ascending third valve, which, because of his influence, remained popular in France well into the 20th century. He was left-handed and used that hand in the bell, reasoning and teaching that players should finger with the right hand, just like all other valve brass instruments. Apparently, other instrument makers remained unconvinced. He was noted for his magnificent tone, beautiful phrasing, and trills. He warned pupils against smoking, shaving the upper lip, don't do it, and eating fried foods, which he considered bad for the lip. These very precautions, however, did not prolong his career. He stopped playing altogether shortly after 1900. He produced a method for valve horn, you can see there on the right, to support his teaching, which was published in 1900 as a collection, as it says, of daily exercises covering a full range of technical challenges for the valve horn. So that appeared in 1900. Before the exercices journaliers, the daily exercises, however, in 1893, on the left, Brémond published a version of the Dauprat method adapted for valve horn use. He also, later on, compiled exercises by Mohr and Gallay and adapted them for the valve horn also, published in 1900 for the Mohr studies, and in 1903 with Gallay. What is most telling, however, is Brémond's foreword to the earlier edition of the Dauprat method, the one here in 1893. After praising Dauprat as the greatest teacher of the horn and noting modifications made to the valved horn by the Raoult family, Bremond makes it very clear where the future lies, and you can see it right here. Quote, the valved horn may be, given these Raoult modifications, called to replace the simple horn, the natural horn, later, but it is necessary, I cannot repeat it too much, to study the two instruments and to play one or the other according to the character of the song one has to perform. So after having worked on the Dauprat method on the natural horn, the simple horn, which is the basis for a horn player's teaching, I advise the student to start it again on the valved horn. To make it easier for the student to carry out this work, I've added at the end of this method charts and the chromatic scale notated with fingerings of the two most used systems. One, the ordinary system with 3 descending pistons, and the system of 3 pistons with the third ascending one tone. Here it is. This is the key. The latter system is the one in use at the horn class at the Conservatoire. Huh, what do you know? As a result, it's clear that by 1893, the transition to the valved horn at the Conservatoire had already begun. Some additional insight into the progress of the valved instrument can be seen in Brémond's choices for the Concours Pieces, at least for the initial part of the aforementioned transition. The pieces chosen for the Concours from 1891 to 1900 include works by, look, Dauprat 1891, Rousselot 1892, who was actually Brémond's uncle, Gallay 1893, Dauprat 1894, Brémond 1895, Gallay 1896, Xavier Leroux 1897, Victorin de Joncière 1898, Henri Maréchal 1899, Raoul Pugnot 1900. Wait, what? Obviously, the pieces by Dauprat, Gallay, and in this case, Rousselot were originally conceived as natural horn pieces. So the only question is whether they were played with valves. Brémond's premier solo, by the way, is actually a very interesting piece, and its range and technique fits the expectations for natural horn, with just enough chromaticism in the middle range to wonder if that maybe he had them play it on natural or on valved horn. But we don't have any evidence, and there's certainly no clues in the score. The Concours piece by Leroux, however, is very interesting. 1897. It starts with the called for natural horn at the beginning. There are, however, boucher sections that require valves to get the right concert pitches. There are some mid-range passages that, at least during the first part, suggest that maybe there was an option of using advanced technique or the valves. However, at the end, or not the end, but later on, there is a section that identifies corps chromatique, and that instrument is identified to the end. It's chromatic from G below middle C all the way to the top of the staff, which is different from the natural horn section preceding it. And the implication in this is that the valved horn was used, but the player should treat it like a natural horn in certain passages with some ambiguity, right? This is the first time that we actually see this in a concours piece. Okay. So, and a couple of just other quick notes. More revealing evidence here is that Brémond's own compositions, all of which are available on IMSLP, dated from as early as 1890 to 1911, show that he was writing pieces for valved horn. And even more so, there are works dedicated to Brémond also available on IMSLP. And look at these: 1894, 1894, and then 1905. We get Villanelle. That's right. That's the one we know. But you'll notice that valve horn pieces were available right from the start. And also, as Burke Anderson has shown, Brémond, who was the subject of his dissertation, actually performed on the valved horn in public with reviews as in the early 1880s forward. So for the person who, is cast as the grudging sort of transition to the valve horn, um, maybe not so much. And of course, maybe we're just reading more into it than is actually there. So, performing practices in brief. Um, Obviously, uh, there are a couple of things that we need to take into consideration. The first is that there are essentially two different ways of thinking about this, right? And both of them involve compromise. It's either hand and valve or hand or valve. What is important to remember is that value was placed on reproducing accurate performances of older compositions. Other aspects of this, composers and performers want to take advantage of open notes in the middle and low ranges that would balance horn parts and allow it to participate fully. Also, composers, as far back as Berlioz, wanted to be able to produce both open and stop notes throughout the full range of the instrument. And these were available with the valve horn, and could be used for expressive performance. And these could also be adapted to individualized contextual performances because of the options available to the performer. So, what does this mean? The compromise for Maifred would combine hand and valve based on a natural horn player's understanding of the instrument. And as a result, we want to make contextual decisions. We're involving intonation and melodic leading or countenance of leading tones and things like that, such that performers would have a lot of choices, but they would be based first and foremost on a natural horn player's understanding. What does that mean for Brémond? It means that the valved horn would be the source of inspiration and foundation of performing, and that the stopped aspects or the hand positions would be used for expressive effects, but in a very different way. They would be used as echo effects or for stopped effects. And so that I think that's a very interesting sort of way of thinking about the difference between this early valve horn at the conservatory and then the later valve horn. It should be noted, however, and this is my concluding remark here, it should be noted there remains a very important elephant in this room, virtual or otherwise. What was the timbre of stop notes during this time? Were they the loud, raspy colors that we use today? Or could they have been something different? Obviously, the concept of timbre associated with stop notes and or notes intended as stopped by composers has ramifications for performance in terms of phrasing in solo passages, as well as for balance and blend in ensemble settings. Personally, I think the answer is obvious, especially in consideration of two things. Number one, respect paid to for performers uh, paid to older compositions, and then the consistent praise and encouragement for the imitation of singing found in natural horn and valve horn methods alike. The goal of evening out open and stopped colors by bringing up the volume, bringing the volume of open notes down a little bit, and the value and bringing up the sound or the volume of stop notes, but still avoiding what they called bruit, the noise that can appear in stop notes if they are played too loudly. Seems to give us all the information we need for performance practice along those lines. But this argument will be left for another day. As a matter of fact, in August during IHS 53, I will present this argument at some at some length. In conclusion, I don't blame anybody who might come away from this presentation feeling somewhat ambivalent about the possibilities for musical expression combined with obvious complexities that are involved in these things. I mean, do we really want to have to think about all these things while we're trying to keep a job? Fair question. It might be worth it. It might not. But I'm telling you right now, at least as far as I'm concerned, it's pretty fun to think about. That's it. I'm ready to take questions. Look at there's questions, I think. Let's see if I can see them. What do I see here? Saint-Saëns wrote all those notes in his 2 romances. Those notes would be heard at all. Not Andrew, I'm not, or Katrina, I know both of you. Saint-Saëns wrote all those notes in his 2 romances. Those ones would be not heard at all. Any comment? Depends on the players, don't you think? Pretty interesting. I'm still not sure how to do that. Okay, let's see here. Where am I doing? An advocate for natural horn education. Do you think that it has more of a future in the classroom, or would you like to see it back on the performance stage? You know, that's a really interesting question, John, because there's something to be said for trying to represent composer intentions, right? And as a result, that means that we could conceivably at least entertain the possibility of playing some stop notes. But is it worth putting your job on the line, calling attention to yourself? Can't answer that because my answer would be no. I wouldn't want to risk my job for some kind of intellectual massage. On the other hand, learning can manifest differently and can gradually, sort of come about. I know, for example, San Francisco Symphony has collaborated between the players and the conductor to allow different equipment at different times, sort of more appropriate. The problem, of course, is does it fit with the rest of the orchestra? If you take a natural horn into a Mozart symphony and yet you're playing with a metal flute and a really great projecting oboe, all that sort of, do you run into problems? And I do believe that needs to be considered. Not sure I can get all the way down to Amanda's question. I may need to stop sharing. Let me stop sharing. Let me do that. All right. Let me see. What else? Sorry, Amanda. Amanda, I can't see your question. I just answered it. Oh, good for. Oh, there we go. Oh, was that it? Okay, sorry. Any others? What can I do? Oh, Saint-Saëns said that. Okay, all right. Well, yeah, that's a very good point.
Well, thank you for an excellent presentation, Dr. Snedeker, the OG himself. We are going to take a short 10-minute. Oh, we got one more question.
That's okay. That's all right. Oh, we do have one more question.
Or do we? No, we don't. I'm just kidding.
Oh, thank you. I wanted to give one more plug to the book. The final proofs are in. It's all up to Routledge. That's who's publishing it. I'm sure I'll have some information available somewhere as soon as it's actually released. But I'm hoping that it comes out in early part of June. So that's my hope. Where you go?
Before IHS. Perfect.
I'm hoping.